Hey everybody, this video is called Round 2, and tonight we continue our pass-through study that we just started this week in the book of Job. We're going to be looking at the next trial mentioned about Job, and we're going to see that the enemy comes against his health in his very next trial. And I hope everyone that observes Thanksgiving had a wonderful time yesterday. I hope you guys enjoyed time with those that you love, family and friends, and good food and fellowship and all that. But we're going to kick this off here in Job chapter 2, verse 1 through 3. It says, "Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, 'From where do you come?' Satan answered the Lord and said, 'From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it.' Then the Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil? And still he holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause.'" So open in chapter 2 here, we see a change in scenery again occurs at the heavenly court. And we see this is where the angels come before the Lord and Satan as they're present, having been again searching for earthly victims to come against, to assault. And God affirms that Job had won the very first round. God confirms that Job is who God defended back in chapter 1. And God uses the same expression the adversary used in the last chapter, verse 9, "for nothing or without cause." And the message behind God's turn of words is that the adversary is the guilty party in this case and not Job, as Job suffered all the disaster without any personal cause. Job had absolutely nothing to do with these trials that came upon him. It is a divine experience taking place. And he had done nothing wrong to incur this pain and loss, though it was massive. And the issue was purely a matter of conflict between God and Satan. And this is a very crucial statement because Job's friends, as we're going to see, they try to explain that Job's life is a hot mess because of something that he did or something that he said. And we see that his friends try to explain that all these disasters had fallen upon him. And we must grasp that Job was not being punished for anything when we read these chapters. And I know there's some Christian circles who will say that Job didn't have enough faith and that's why all these trials came upon him and baloney like that. But Job suffered for nothing related to him personally. It wasn't any sin that he did. It wasn't anything that he earned. And like I mentioned, it wasn't because Job lacked faith. And what we must understand is that sometimes suffering is going to come that's caused by divine purposes out of our control and unknowable to us. In verse 4 through 6 it says, "So Satan answered the Lord and said, 'Skin for skin, yes, all that a man has will give for his life. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face.' And the Lord said to Satan, 'Behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life.'" So we see that Satan contend that he had only just begun scratching the surface against Job. And Job endured the loss of all that he had. And we saw back in chapter 1 on Tuesday the terrible losses that Job had. He lost his livestock and his wealth. But on the hardest thing to hit Job was losing his children. And we see that his children's lives were lost, but it wouldn't endure the loss of his own well-being. And if God allowed Satan to make a disaster a personal matter on his own physical body, the adversary contended that Job's faith would fail. And for many of us, our faith might fail when we study the story of Job. Is there anything in this life that can knock you out of your faith in Christ? Is there something that you would throw in the towel for? If you lost all your children, all your house to a fire, everything that you built and worked for, where is your faith going to stand? And the Lord sovereignly limited the adversary, although death seemed preferable. And Job believed that to be the case along with his wife. In verse 7 and 8 it says, "So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took for himself a potsherd with which to scrape himself while he sat in the midst of the ashes." So God's permissive will operated for purposes that Job cannot know. And God was hidden from him along with the reasons for his suffering. And although the nature of Job's affliction can't be diagnosed exactly, it produced extreme physical trauma, as we're going to see across this book in the testimony of Job. And we cannot fully understand Job's conversations throughout the book without considering this extraordinary physical distress that is on him, that he endured in a day without medicine and pain relief. And Job couldn't take what we might take today when we have a fever or a headache or pain. Some might take Tylenol, Motrin, Advil, whatever else is out there. This wasn't around back in the time of Job. And his boils would have been very similar to what we find back in the Old Testament with the Egyptians back in Exodus chapter 9, verse 8 through 11, as well as Hezekiah's illness back in 2 Kings 20, verse 7. And one thing we must note is that as Job suffered terribly, he took himself to where the lepers go, the ash heap outside the city where he scraped at the sores with a piece of broken pottery. And perhaps it was like a form of relief by breaking them open to release this infection. And this attack on Job was the enemy's intent to make Job curse God. And back in Deuteronomy chapter 28, and if you were following me earlier in the summer and fall when we talked about the blessings for obedience and cursings for disobedience, and back in Deuteronomy 28:27, God promised a disobedient Israel that they would suffer with things such as what Job suffered with the boils and tumors, with the scab and the itch that they would not be able to find healing from. And Job may have it similarly, which can explain why he felt cursed by God. Now, Job didn't curse God, but he felt like God was against him. And when we go through some of the toughest battles, such as losing a child, the flesh might tell us that God is against us. But we must remember, if you are a believer in Christ, Romans chapter 8, that God is not against you, God is for you. And we're going to see more details as we make our way through this book over the next few months of Job, of what Job had suffered and how long the condition lasts. In verse 9 and 10 it says, "Then his wife said to him, 'Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die.' But he said to her, 'You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity?' And all of this, Job did not sin with his lips." And there's some lessons that we get out of verses 9 and 10 here. And Job's faith remained strong even in this hard time of life with this physical ailment that's really pushing him to the test. And he remained strong in this time of what was probably confusion. When we go through traumatic life experiences, it brings confusion upon us. Why me? Why am I going through this? Therefore, his wife couldn't accuse him of insincerity as Satan had. And her argument, in effect, was to let go of your pity and curse God so that you can get over this. God will end your life for blaspheming. So we can kind of see the logic behind his wife here. In what Job experienced, many would find death as an easier way out at this time period for this physical ailment. And his wife added temptation to affliction because she advised him to sin. And I wanted to make mention that maybe you've had different medical conditions where you wanted to die because it would probably be the easier way out of it. And one of the most painful things people talk about, and I pray I don't have to experience it, is passing a kidney stone. I've heard some pretty horrific statements and testimonies from people on that. And what we see here is that Job's wife adds temptation to affliction because she advised him to sin. And notice in verse 10, foolish isn't speaking of silly or ridiculous like we might use the term foolish, like, you're acting foolish, but acting as one who rejects God or his revealed will. And in chapter 2 here, with Job's health, we see this is the divine will of God for Job to go through this. And I know somewhere out there, if a Word of Faith preacher heard that right now, they're going like, ah! But sometimes life challenges, or, when we go through different scenarios in life, it's not that God has walked away or that we're being punished. Sometimes there is a purpose behind what we are going through. And the word foolish is used of the unwise in the Psalms, such as Psalm 14 verse 1 and Psalm 53 verse 1, where both verses say, and the fool says in his heart that there is no God. And also Proverbs 30 verse 22. And one thing we should note is after verse 10, we don't see anything about Job's foolish wife again. She won't be heard of again in this book, except as indirectly in chapter 42, verse 13 through 15. And we see that Job lived out and explained the text of Deuteronomy 29:29, which is homework for you to check out on your own. And we see his words and his deeds demonstrated his confidence in God and indicated God's confidence in him. And we might judge, when we read verses 9 and 10, we might be judging Job's wife. We might think of her as cruel or unsupported or a sharp-tongued wife. But we must consider that what Job has gone through so far with losing his wealth and losing his children and losing, his comfort and health, we must realize that his wife had to witness this take place. So we should consider her losses and how it could be messing with her prior to this. And child loss is one of the hardest things that, if not the hardest thing, that you can experience in this life. We don't ever think that our children are going to pass on to eternity before us. But here it is, happens, and somebody around you is a grieving parent. And one thing I want to make mention of is on the topic of grief, is grief can make us prone to act in the flesh. And I've seen people, and I've heard testimonies of people who really the flesh comes out of them in their grief. And as she lost her children, Steve Lawson, one of my favorite speakers and Bible expositors, once stated that she could not bear to see her husband suffer this way now. And so we see that Job's wife is weak in hope. And note also that Job did not accuse her of being a foolish woman. Let's read it again here in verse 10. He says, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. He doesn't say, you are a foolish woman who speaks. So, we should make note of that Job says she's speaking like one of the foolish women, not that she is one. And he's saying she's acting out of character. This is not who she is. And I love verse 10. In all of this, we see that Job did not sin with his lips. We didn't see that Job, lost his temper in response to either his God or his wife. And there's false teaching in the charismatic circle or some other circles that calamities came upon Job because of negative confession, the words that he spoke back in chapter 1 verse 5 and chapter 3 verse 25 in the next chapter tomorrow. And verse 11 through 13 says, now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this adversary that had come upon him, each one came to his own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. For they had made an appointment together to come and mourn with him and to comfort him. And when they raised their eyes from afar and did not recognize him, they lifted their voices and wept. And each one tore his robe and sprinkled dust on his head toward heaven. So they sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great. So Teman was a city of Edom back in Genesis 36 verse 4, Genesis 36:11, Jeremiah 49:7, Jeremiah 49:20, Ezekiel 25 verse 13, Amos 1:12, and the book of Obadiah verse 8 and 9. And the Shuhites, they were the descendants of Abraham through Keturah in Genesis 25 verse 2 and Genesis 25 verse 6. And Naamathite was a resident of an unknown location that was most likely either Edom or Arabia, although some suggested that Naamah on the Edomite border in Joshua 15 verse 41. But besides the geographical things, what we must note here is Job's grief was great. It was an expression that meant that his disease caused great pain on him. That was increasing as time is going on. And the agony is so great for Job that his friends were speechless for a week. They didn't know what to say. And when we go through different life tragedies, sometimes we don't know what to say to those that we love. You can say sorry for your loss, for child loss, but that ain't gonna, fix anything. We see it as unfair. And these verses are the most moving scenes in the whole book of Job, as Job's friends came to comfort and sympathize with him in his pain. They may not have had words, but they really did care for him, even though they had bad theology. And they expressed all the traditional gestures of grief. And their names were Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, which we're going to be looking at throughout the next 35 chapters. So, to wrap up this video today, we see that God boasts again about his servant a second time at the second act of a heavenly scene. And we see that Satan has a reply that, Job's not who you think you are, God. Let me get my hands on him. And Satan suggests a new test for Job with physical suffering. And Job is smitten with a painful and disgusting sores. And we see that Satan was granted power to attack mankind in ways that we may not be able to wrap our minds around or perceive. And in the New Testament, we find a very similar passage that comes to mind involving a woman that was afflicted for 18 years. And she's afflicted and she was bound by Satan, from what Dr. Luke tells us about she's bound by Satan in her condition. And I want to go over to Luke chapter 13. Luke 13, verse 10 says, "Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And behold, there was a woman who had a spirit of infirmity 18 years, and was bent over, and could in no way raise herself up. But when Jesus saw her, he called her to him, and said to her, Woman, you are loosed from your infirmity. And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight, and glorified God. But the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation, because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, and he said to the crowd, There are 6 days on which a man to work. Therefore come and be healed on them, and not on the Sabbath day. The Lord then answered him, and said, Hypocrite, does not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or donkey from the stall and lead it away to water it? So ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound, think of it, for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath? And when he said all these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the multitude rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him." So we see in the story of Job that he holds his integrity before his wife. And even though his wife is acting within her grief out in the flesh, we see that Job doesn't lose his grip. And we see that the chapter ends with the consolation of Job's friends. And that's going to wrap up today's video. We'll see you next, as we're going to look at Job expressing himself in the flesh of cursing his birth. So we'll see that tomorrow in tomorrow's study. I hope you have a great rest of your evening. God bless.